The book that you're about to read is called The Cloven Viscount by an Italian named Italo Calvino. This book is a little bit older than me. Calvino wrote it just a few years after World War II. He was an Italian writer and he lived through World War II, and he really did get to see some of the horrors of war. It's um, it's hard really for modern people to imagine the horrors that people witnessed during World War II, and Italo Calvino was not blind to what happened. This book is called, and it's a tricky title, The Cloven Viscount. We're reading the second part, and I need you to know what the title means. Cloven means cut in half, like if you take an apple and you cut it directly in half. And Viscount, remember you don't pronounce the S, Viscount is another way of saying count. He's an Italian count or an Italian nobleman. And really, because the story takes place 400 years ago, he's what you would call a knight. He's the kind of guy who dresses in armor when he goes off to battle. In fact, in this book, when he does go off to battle, he looks a little bit like Don Quixote. He's thin like Don Quixote. He has a squire, a trusty squire with like Don Quixote. He carries a lance like Don Quixote. In a lot of ways, he looks like that character from another important literary work. And of course, Italo Calvino would have read Don Quixote and he would have been familiar with that character. But this is a very different story. This story is very much so a fantasy story. The things, and you have to understand what that means, the genre of fantasy. It means the things in this story cannot possibly happen in the real world. But it also means that the things that do happen, they often have an important or symbolic significance. So as you're reading this story, you have to understand the symbolism behind it. Now, the reason the book is called The Cloven Viscount is it is about this count who decides to go away to war. There are wars happening in Bohemia, and this count is a Christian, and he fights for the imperial army. They're fighting against the Turks, which is another way of saying the Ottomans or the Muslims. So this is a religious war. And when the Count goes away to war, one of the things we discover in the first few chapters is things are bloody, things are awful. The imagery of war is horrific. Dead bodies, dead body parts, plague, disease. It's awful. And the Viscount goes away to war not really prepared or experienced in fighting war. Well, very quickly, the Viscount gets hit by a cannonball. And that's how you can tell this is a fantasy story, because one of the things that happens because the Viscount gets hit by a cannonball is he gets split exactly in two, completely in two, right down the middle. So what does it make it a fantasy? Well, he doesn't die. The doctors fix him, or them. You see, the Cloven Viscount's not going to die just because he was split in two by a cannonball. He's going to be cut in half, and he's going to become two different people. Let's read chapter 1 and 2, and then let's talk some more. It's going to be good.